There's a quiet moment when you realize that everything you believed about perception might just be another layer of your own self-deception. Erich Fromm, when analyzing modern psychological systems, pointed to a silent dilemma: the tendency to simplify the complexity of the human soul. Gestalt psychology, though revolutionary in bringing perception and the whole into focus, made a similar mistake. It ignored emotional shadows, fragmented traumatic memories, and the unconscious bonds that shape how we see the world. And it's in this blind spot of Gestalt that lies a truth few dare to reveal. Not everything that appears as form can be integrated without pain. Perhaps you've heard about the famous Gestalt principle: the whole is greater than the sum of its parts. But what if this whole is an illusion constructed by your need for control? What if the very search for perceptual organization is a defense mechanism against what your soul hasn't yet had the courage to face? Gestalt taught us to see patterns, to form figures against backgrounds, to seek closure of incomplete experiences. But it forgot to warn us about something fundamental. Not every figure needs to be formed. Not every background needs to be understood. And not every closure is true. Something exists that Gestalt psychology could never explain satisfactorily. Why some people, even when clearly perceiving their patterns, remain trapped in the same self-destructive cycles. The answer lies in what it ignored. The trauma that doesn't form a figure, but distorts the entire perceptual field. Complex traumas don't manifest as figure against ground, but as persistent noise in perception. Imagine that your ability to see the world was shaped by experiences your child mind couldn't process. These memories don't organize into clear forms. They become invisible filters that alter everything you see, feel, and interpret. Government shows how early pain experiences shape the nervous system and create internal figures that Gestalt cannot symbolize. A child who grew up in an environment of constant threat develops a hypervigilant perceptual system. She doesn't see the world as it is, but as it could be dangerous. This isn't a poorly formed figure that needs correction, but a deep adaptation of the nervous system that requires healing, not just awareness. The unconscious search for Gestalt closure can mask wounds that never healed. How many times have you tried to resolve an emotional situation through rational understanding, only to discover that the same pattern returned even more intensely? This happens because trauma doesn't function as an incomplete experience waiting for closure. It functions as a lens that distorts everything that passes through it. Gestalt assumes you have free access to your perception. But what if your perception is the result of an unconscious negotiation with pain? What if what you see is only what you can bear to see? The perceptual field isn't neutral. It's shaped by traumas, culture, childhood, neurochemistry, and language that create invisible boundaries around what you allow yourself to perceive. Gestalt prizes perceptual organization. But what if chaos is exactly what needs to be felt, not corrected? There's a silent tyranny of clarity that prevents us from inhabiting the shadowy territories of the soul. Those spaces where there's still no form, where there's still no answer, where there's still no relief. Nietzsche would say that order is often a disguise for the fear of looking into the abyss. When Gestalt trains us to organize our experience, seek patterns, and form coherent figures, it may be inadvertently teaching us to flee from the discomfort of emptiness. Exactly where the deepest transformations reside. Think about your own life. How many times have you felt compelled to understand a painful situation, to organize it into a narrative that made sense, only to discover that this understanding was a sophisticated way of avoiding feeling what was really happening? The need for clarity can become an addiction, a way to maintain safe distance from the raw, crude, unprocessed experience. The practical application of this is devastating. We learn to form figures to escape the discomfort of emptiness, and this generates false solutions. When something in your life doesn't make sense, when a relationship ends confusingly, when you feel professionally lost, the Gestalt tendency is to seek an explanation that closes the cycle. But what if premature closure is preventing you from discovering something fundamental about yourself? Internal chaos isn't a problem to be solved. It's a territory to be inhabited. The parts of you that still don't make sense, that still don't fit into the coherent narrative of your identity, may be exactly those that carry the keys to real transformation. The addiction to clarity keeps you away from the fertile darkness where new forms of being are gestating. The whole is greater than the sum of its parts. But what happens when the parts have been denied, silenced, repressed? There's a profound danger in trying to integrate aspects of yourself that haven't been truly recognized. It's like trying to sew fabric with threads you refuse to see. Jung warned, trying to integrate without recognizing the unconscious generates ego inflation. When you try to form a coherent whole of your personality without including aspects that were rejected, denied, or repressed, the result isn't integration. It's an illusion of completeness that makes the shadow even more powerful. I remember a woman who spent years trying to integrate her anger through Gestalt techniques, forming clear figures about her conflicts, organizing her perceptions about relationships, but never allowing the anger to actually be felt in the body, expressed authentically, or recognized as a legitimate part of her nature. The result? She developed a spiritualized version of her personality that seemed integrated, but it actually created a new form of dissociation. The anger was still there, but now it was disguised as wisdom or compassion. An even more subtle form of self-rejection. Real integration requires that you first recognize what was exiled. It's not possible to form an authentic whole by ignoring the parts that were considered unacceptable. Gestalt, with its emphasis on perceptual organization, can inadvertently reinforce the tendency to keep the disorganized parts of personality out of the field of vision. What part of you was exiled so that the socially acceptable persona could exist? This is the question Gestalt rarely asks, and it's exactly there that lies the key to true integration. The whole that Gestalt seeks may be just another sophisticated mask, another way of avoiding the uncomfortable truth that you are fundamentally multiple, contradictory, and unresolvable. The perceptual field isn't neutral. It's shaped by traumas, culture, childhood, neurochemistry, and language. Gestalt assumes you have direct access to reality through perception. But what if your perception is the result of a long unconscious negotiation with pain, fear, and the need for survival? Neuroscience studies show how the prefrontal cortex chooses what to perceive based on unconscious emotional maps. Your brain isn't a passive receiver of information. It's an active filter that selects, distorts, and organizes reality based on past experiences, future expectations, and present emotional needs. This means that what you perceive as figure may only be what your nervous system considered safe to perceive. What remains as background may be exactly what contains the most important information about your true nature and deepest needs. Your conditioned perceptual field keeps you trapped in limited versions of reality, versions that are functional for survival, but may be preventing real growth. True perception isn't one that organizes experience, but one that allows experience to reveal itself in its raw and unfiltered complexity. There's a way to begin recognizing this conditioning. Instead of focusing on what's obvious, clear, and organizable, start paying attention to what you systematically ignore, avoid, or consider irrelevant. What kind of person do you never notice on the street? What emotions do you feel very vaguely, without being able to name them? What childhood memories seem nebulous, confusing, or charged with discomfort you can't explain? What dreams do you forget immediately upon waking? These blind spots in perception may contain more information about who you really are than everything you clearly see. Insight without body is rationalization. This is one of the most seductive errors of the Gestalt approach, the belief that awareness per se is sufficient for transformation. How many times have you had a revelation about an emotional pattern, felt you had finally understood something fundamental about yourself, only to discover that nothing really changed? Gestalt often focuses on here and now awareness as its panacea, but this can generate disconnection from somatic memories and pre-verbal experiences. Rational consciousness can become a sophisticated way of avoiding the bodily experience of emotion, exactly where a real transformation occurs. Viktor Frankl reminded us, consciousness without meaning is torture. It's not enough to know you have a self-destructive pattern. You need to understand what function that pattern serves, what deep need it tries to meet in a distorted way. But there's something even deeper. Often, true healing doesn't come from consciousness, but from the ability to sustain experience without needing to understand it. The compulsion for insight can itself be a form of resistance to the raw vulnerability of not knowing. Think about a moment in your life when you healed from something significant. Was it through intellectual understanding or through an experience that transformed something in your body, in your energy, in your capacity to feel? Real healing often happens in territories that consciousness cannot map, in silences, in presences, in moments of surrender that cannot be organized into clear figures. Gestalt teaches us to seek consciousness as a goal. But what if consciousness is just a byproduct of something deeper? The ability to inhabit your own experience with compassion and presence. The awareness that heals is not the one that understands, but the one that embraces without needing to explain. The tendency to organize, make sense, and close cycles may be a reflection of the fear of impermanence. There's a shadow dimension of the Gestalt impulse that's rarely discussed, the need for control disguised as a search for understanding. When you feel a compulsion to organize an emotional experience, to form a clear figure about a conflict, to seek closure of an unfinished situation, stop and ask yourself, is this really a need for growth or an attempt to control something that's out of your control? The closure of the figure can become compulsion for premature emotional endings. How many times have you ended a relationship or made an important decision not because you were really ready, but because you couldn't sustain the tension of indefinition? How many times have you created an explanation for something that still needed to be lived, not understood? Emotional life doesn't function like a puzzle that needs to be assembled. It functions like a river that needs to be navigated. Some experiences have no closure. Some pains have no explanation. Some questions have no answer. And this isn't a problem to be solved, but a dimension of existence to be accepted. There's a practice that can transform your relationship with uncertainty. Begin to consciously live with open forms. Situations, people, and memories that don't yet have an ending. Practice sustaining relationships that aren't defined. Projects that have no guarantee of success. Emotions that cannot be named. The ability to inhabit indefinition may be more transformative than any insight. Control is an illusion, but the illusion of control is one of the most sophisticated forms of suffering. Gestalt, with its emphasis on perceptual organization, can inadvertently reinforce the fantasy that you can organize emotional life, the same way you organize visual perception. Let me tell you about someone I worked with. Let's call her Marina. She arrived after years of Gestalt therapy with impressive awareness about her relational patterns. She knew how to identify her projections, recognized when she was repeating childhood dynamics, could form clear figures about her emotional conflicts. But there was a problem. She continued getting involved with men who emotionally mistreated her. Even with all her Gestalt awareness, even knowing how to recognize the signs, even having exhaustively worked her incomplete figures related to her absent father, she invariably chose partners who reproduced the same patterns of abandonment and rejection. What the Gestalt approach had missed was the invisible, somatic memories from the early years of life that were stored in the body, not in consciousness. Marina had a bodily memory of safety associated with the state of constant alertness. Her neurophysiology had been shaped by experiences of emotional neglect so early that they never became conscious memories. Her perception was a shield, not a mirror. What she saw in relationships was filtered by a nervous system that had learned to associate love with pain, intimacy with danger, care with control. Gestalt consciousness had become a sophisticated form of intellectualization. She could perfectly describe her patterns, but couldn't feel them in her body, couldn't access the pre-verbal layers where the patterns actually resided. Real transformation only happened when she began working with raw bodily sensations. The tightness in her chest when she felt loved, the nausea when someone treated her gently, the subtle terror that arose whenever a relationship became safe. These sensations didn't form clear figures, but they were the key to understanding how her history had shaped her capacity to love. The Gestalt emphasis on clear perception had kept her trapped in a cognitive understanding that never touched the somatic reality of her trauma. What you're seeing, is it really your field, or a lens that was imposed by your pain? This is the question Gestalt rarely asks, and it's exactly there that lies the difference between awareness and transformation. Sometimes the most important information about who you are is hidden in what you systematically refuse to perceive. Gestalt psychology opened valuable paths, but like every approach, it has its blind spots. If you've been feeling that you understand what you're living but remain trapped in the same emotional patterns, perhaps you're trying to assemble a puzzle with pieces that don't yet have form. It's not about rejecting Gestalt, but going beyond what it could see. The perceptual field is more than what we can consciously organize. It includes everything that was denied, repressed, dissociated, or simply never had a chance to be seen. True individuation doesn't happen through organizing experience, but through the ability to sustain experience in its raw and unresolved complexity. Perhaps it's time to stop trying to form clear figures and start inhabiting the nebulous spaces where your true nature is still waiting to be discovered. There's a profound difference between understanding your pain and inhabiting your pain, between organizing your experience and allowing your experience to transform you, between seeking closure and accepting the perpetual openness that is the human condition. Gestalt taught us to see patterns, but forgot to teach us to love chaos. It taught us to seek figures, but forgot to teach us to dance with the background. It taught us to close cycles, but forgot to teach us that some cycles are infinite, and that precisely in this lies their beauty. The parts of you that don't make sense, that resist organization, that refuse to fit into coherent narratives, may be exactly the parts that carry the medicine your soul needs. There's wisdom in not understanding everything about yourself. There's power in allowing some aspects of your being to remain mysterious, undefined, open to infinite possibility. The compulsion to organize all your experience into clear figures may be preventing you from accessing the feral darkness where new forms of consciousness are always being born. What if the goal isn't to understand yourself completely, but to love yourself completely, including the parts that will forever remain beyond understanding? What are you trying to organize emotionally that you haven't yet had the courage to look at directly? Perhaps it's time to stop trying to form a clear figure about this experience and start inhabiting it with presence and compassion. What do you discover when you stop trying to understand and simply allow it to be? Sometimes what we can't organize is exactly what has something important to teach us about who we really are. The invitation isn't to reject the valuable insights of Gestalt psychology, but to recognize its limitations and go beyond them. Your true nature isn't a puzzle to be solved or a figure to be formed. It's a living mystery to be continuously discovered, embraced, and allowed to unfold in its own perfect timing. In the space between understanding and mystery, between form and formlessness, between closure and perpetual opening, you may find the freedom you've been seeking all along. If this exploration has touched something deep within you, if you recognize yourself in these shadows that Gestalt couldn't illuminate, you're not alone in this journey of discovery. There are others walking this path of authentic self-understanding, questioning what they've been taught to see and daring to look at what they've been taught to ignore. I invite you to share in the comments below what aspect of your emotional life you've been trying to organize but continues to resist any form of understanding. Sometimes the courage to name what we can't explain is the first step toward true transformation. And if you feel called to continue this journey of psychological depth and existential exploration, consider subscribing to join our community of seekers who aren't satisfied with surface-level answers. Together, we explore the territories that conventional psychology often overlooks, the spaces where real healing and authentic self-discovery happen. Your willingness to question, to sit with uncertainty, to embrace the unknown parts of yourself is exactly what this world needs more of.